American baseball is generally a fairly civilized sport, but occasionally it will move into fisticuffs, though maybe not as often as you would expect in something like hockey. One particular fight on May 15th, 1894, between Baltimore third baseman John McGraw and Boston first baseman Tommy Tucker grew rather heated. And as fans watched the fight, the stadium grew, well, rather heated as well. The Great Roxbury Fire started in the baseball stadium that's called the South End Grounds, and before it was done, it would become one of the most destructive fires in the history of the city of Boston. The Boston Globe said dryly of the game, "It was a hot game, sure enough." It is history that deserves to be remembered. American professional baseball in the decade of the 1890s was dominated by two teams, the Boston Beaneaters and the Baltimore Orioles, who combined for 8 pennants. Author Kate Murphy explained in her 2007 book, Crazy '08, how a cast of cranks, rogues, boneheads, and magnets created the greatest year in baseball history. The Orioles won 3 straight pennants, making them the second best team of the decade. Boston, which won 5 pennants that decade, was better, but it is the Orioles who are remembered as the team of the 90s, not just for their skill, but also for their style. That style could lead to some on-field fireworks, Murphy continues. Aggressive and creative, the O's either invented or perfected the hit and run, the Baltimore chop, the suicide squeeze, and the bunt single. They also led the league in unsportsmanlike conduct. 1894 represented something of a turning point between these two teams. In 1893, Boston had won its 3rd straight pennant, but Baltimore was about to start its own streak. And in that game on May 15th, Baltimore was clearly ascendant. The two teams had played on May 14th, and Baltimore had won easily, 16 runs to 5. At the time, Baltimore was number 2 in the league standings, while Boston was a lackluster 5th. Part of the reason that Baltimore was so successful, but also so aggressive, was the play of John McGraw. His biography at the National Baseball Hall of Fame explains, standing just 5'7" and weighing 155 pounds, McGraw broke into the National League with the Baltimore Orioles in 1891 and was one of the game's early stars. McGraw was one of Baltimore's so-called Big Four, along with Joe Kelly, Henry Jennings, and Willie Keeler. He was also a scrapper, the Hall of Fame continues. The oldest of 8 children born to Irish immigrant parents, McGraw learned how to fight for everything that was given to him. On the other side of the field was Boston first baseman Tommy Tucker. Another early baseball star, Tucker was the first switch hitter to win the Major League batting title in 1889. Tucker was, like McGraw, famously aggressive. A biography by the Society for American Baseball Research says of him, always an aggressive in-your-face type, he led the league 5 times in being hit by pitches. He became downright fractious, perfecting a trick on wild pickoff throws to first base of falling heavily on top of the runner to prevent him from advancing. He was known for spouting off, earning the nicknames Tommy Talker, Noisy Tom, and Foghorn. The two cantankerous players were dry tinder for an unavoidable conflagration. Blogger David Hill, writing on the sports fan page Fansided, explains, "It was a match that seemed destined to happen. On one side, there was Baltimore Orioles third baseman John McGraw, who essentially feuded with everyone during his playing days. On the other side was Boston Beaneaters first baseman Tommy Tucker, whose nickname Foghorn came from his loudness on the field in all aspects. It was inevitable that the two would tangle at some point. And that point was in the 3rd inning of the game played on May 15th. The game was being played in Boston at the famous South End Grounds. The South End Grounds have been the home of the Boston team since its formation in 1871. The team had originally been called the Red Stockings, so named because several of the original players had come from the recently disbanded Cincinnati Red Stockings. The Society for American Baseball Research described the field. The grounds for this new team were located along the border between Boston's South End and the newly annexed town of Roxbury, which had become part of the city of Boston in 1868. The site was rectangular in shape, bounded on the east side by Berlin Street and by the tracks of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad to the west. The railroad proved to be a harsh neighbor. Passing trains could be counted on to periodically rain smoke and cinders down on the third base patrons and on the field itself. A baseball historian has written, if the wind was right and the traffic was heavy, games were halted in order to allow the haze generated by the trains to clear. The team did well in the early years, winning National Association pennants from 1872 to 1875, but their profitability dipped after the creation of the National League in 1876. In 1877, 3 Boston businessmen, Arthur Sodden, James Billings, and William Connett took over majority ownership of the indebted franchise. The three would become known as the Triumvirs. While the three produced successful teams and could be known to open their wallets to acquire big-name players, they also saw baseball as a business and were notorious penny pitchers. In 1887, the Triumvirs decided that it was time to construct a new stadium. The team, by then called the Beaneaters, had surprising success, winning National League pennants in 1877, 1878, and 1883, and a new stadium would mean more ticket sales. The Boston Globe reported a cost estimate of $25,000, but by the time the stadium was finished, the cost would spiral to an astronomical $70,000. The new stadium was, by all accounts, marvelous. Called the Grand Pavilion, the stadium featured massive columns capped with witches' caps, common for the era. The Boston Herald called it a grandstand unequaled for beauty and convenience in the country. A 2012 article on the Sports Collector's Digest said that it looked like something out of a fairy tale. The Boston Globe used dramatic flair to describe the opening game at the new field in 1888. Truly, another opening day like yesterday on the South End grounds would seriously threaten all the tender memories connected with the history of Boston. The Battle of Bunker Hill, the dumping of obnoxious oolong into the slimy waters of the harbor, the ride of Paul Revere fade into nothingness compared with the opening of this league season at the Hub. The stadium was state-of-the-art, including, according to the Herald, restaurants at both ends, from which the public could be supplied with refreshments, and toilet rooms for the ladies, with all the modern improvements. The field was long and narrow, 250 feet to left, 450 feet to dead center, and 255 feet to right. There was a large double-deck grandstand behind home plate, uncovered stands down the baselines, and bleachers in the right corner. The stadium had an official capacity of 6,800, but managed to tuck in more than twice that, 15,000 on opening night. The pavilion at the South End grounds was still considered by many to be the finest grandstand in professional baseball on May 15th, 1894, when the inflammatory personalities of Tommy Foghorn Tucker and Jim Bugsy McGraw finally collided. Literally. Hill explains, during a play in the third inning, Tucker slid into third, where McGraw was waiting with the ball. As he applied the tag, McGraw kicked Tucker in the head. The Beaneaters' first baseman, not the type of person to take such an insult lightly, jumped up and punched McGraw. The two began exchanging punches in a fierce battle at third base, with the crowd cheering the battle on. The inning ended with the two still fighting, keeping the crowd's attention. But the attention of Boston outfielder Jimmy Bannon, coming onto the field, was drawn to something else. The on-field fireworks had apparently distracted the crowd from a fire in a more literal sense. The New England Historical Society explains. The Beaneaters' Jimmy Foxy Grandpa Bannon ran out to play right field, saw the fire and tried to stamp it out with his feet. That didn't work, so he tried his cap. The Globe wrote, his eagle eyes through the tiers of seats detected a running fire, and he rushed under the seats and tried to stamp out the fire with his feet. For a few moments he appeared to hold the little blaze under control, and with his cap he tried to smother the embers. It is somewhat ironic that the antics of two well-known fiery tempers contributed to, well, a real fire. The Society for American Baseball Research notes, the conflagration in the initial stages could easily have been stomped out, but it was ignored by the crowd, who were caught up in the fracas on the end of the field and its aftermath, until the end of the inning. By then the flames had reached such severity that they had forced stoppage of the game. There are competing stories over how the fire started. One account has the fire being started accidentally by a group of boys, with the New York Times describing them as some small Roxbury boys who set themselves up as rivals to Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Another account, based on the witness of a 14-year-old boy who snuck into the game, blamed a carelessly discarded match dropped by a man lighting a cigar. In any case, the spark found tinder. According to the Society for American Baseball Research, a rotting portion of the center field bleachers had been removed during the off-season, and workers had left sawdust and debris behind, under the right field seats. As Bannon tried to stamp out the fire, the New England Historical Society explains, a 24-mile-per-hour wind carried the fire to the grandstand, which was soon engulfed in flames. The Globe wrote, it was only then that little right fielder Bannon, blackened and exhausted, gave up his efforts to stem the fire. In a few moments, the whole mass of the right field bleachers was a solid sea of flames. A little while later, the whole pavilion was ablaze, the fire running wizard-like up its highest tower. One vast cloud of fire appeared to fill the structure, whose creaking and crashing timbers added to the somber grandeur of the scene. The Society explains, some fans poured into the surrounding neighborhoods, others crowded into the ball field where the heat became almost unbearable. They watched nearly the entire structure burn within 45 minutes. But the loss was not limited to the finest grandstand in the league. The society continues. East of the ball field was a crowded neighborhood of old wooden and 1- and 2-story tenement homes. Fire quickly spread to houses on Berlin Street, along Walpole towards Tremont, igniting houses on Walpole, Cunard, Burke, and Coventry streets. The Boston Globe lamented, "Few could understand how so extensive a fire could grow from a blaze that could have been stomped out by any one of the spectators at the ball game when it was discovered." A May 1894 issue of the Sporting News described the speed of the fire. The fire, which originated in and destroyed the Boston ballpark on May 15th, was one of the most remarkable on record for the rapidity with which the flames and fumes did their destructive work. In less than 3 hours, 12 acres of territory were burned over. The baseball grandstand and bleachers, a large schoolhouse, an engine house, 164 wooden dwellings, and 13 brick buildings were burned, and nearly 1,000 families were made homeless. The New England Historical Society remarks that one of the houses destroyed belonged to groundskeeper John Haggerty, who led fans to safety and then ran to the nearest firehouse to alert the fire department at 4:22. When they arrived, they struggled, the society continues. Fire companies found no hydrants near the ballpark. They lost precious moments stretching long lines of hose. A second alarm was struck at 4:25, a third at 4:42, and a fourth at 4:51. The Globe described the difficulty faced by the firefighters. The fire flowed into Tremont Street in perfect sheets of flames, which blinded and drove the firemen before it. The heat was so terrible that no human being could stand it, and so sudden did the fire envelop the front of the street that it was with difficulty that some half-dozen engines were hauled to a place of safety, from whence they could continue the fight. Sports Collector's Digest recalls, "It would not be until 7 p.m. that evening that the fire was brought under control. Help had been summoned from all cities and towns within a 10-mile radius of Boston to combat the blaze." The Globe reported the extent of the final damage. 12 acres were burned over. 200 buildings were completely destroyed. 1,900 people were rendered homeless. The fire had burned through some of the poorest sections of town. People desperately tried to remove their belongings, but in many cases the fire simply came too fast, leaving many with nothing left, having, as the Globe described it, lost their little all. The Globe told some of their stories. Mrs. Donovan of 52 Berlin Street was especially pitied as she sat among the motley crowd in the vestry of the Ruggles Street Church. She has 3 small children to support. Her husband died a short time ago, and she has had a hard time to support her little ones. The fire destroyed everything of value she had. She was forced to flee from the house without being able to save anything. The next day, the citizens of Boston surveyed the damage. The Globe reported, "Hardly a vestige of the many wooden dwellings that had sheltered the hundreds of families there was to be seen. The fact in itself serves to emphasize the intensity of the heat, while the flames raged in their element." In the days that followed, families sought missing children, and children their parents. Firefighters sifted through debris. The conclusion, after the search, was startling. In the fire that had burned so hot and so fast, not one person is known to have died in the blaze. Boston has been the scene of many fires in its long history, and many of those included significant loss of life. The 1942 Coconut Grove fire, for example, resulted in the loss of 492 lives. And in the face of that, what was at the time called the Great Roxbury Fire or the Great South End Grounds Fire seems little remembered today. In 2012, author Tom Barch went in search of what was once described as the greatest grandstand in the league, only to find that the South End grounds proved elusive. There's virtually no trace of it in modern-day Boston. While there were various accusations and recriminations regarding the fire department response, in the end no one was held accountable. People around Boston and the nation opened their hearts and wallets to the many who lost their property. Owing to the nature of the property destroyed, much was not insured, and only around half of the estimated $300,000 in damage was covered. Among the underinsured were the triumvirs. The stadium was insured for less than half its value. A new stadium was built on the same site in just 10 weeks, opening in July. But having less money, it was a far less impressive single-story edifice, this time made of brick and steel. The stadium served the team, which shifted names by then to the Boston Braves, until 1914. In the end, the greatest lesson appears to be in one of penny pinching. The Society for American Baseball Research notes that a fire hydrant had been installed inside the stadium, but apparently owners had decided not to pay the fee that would be necessary to turn the water on. If that is true, the Boston Globe wrote in an editorial just 2 days after the fire, then it would appear that for the sake of $15, the grandstand, worth $80,000, was imperiled. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history. And if you did enjoy, feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net. And of course, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.